Hi, this is Charles, and I came across a PowerPoint presentation made by Kevin Sharp and Brad Smith that does an excellent job of introducing people to the Lock and Load series. Not only does it really cover the Heroes of the Gap, but it also covers the basic mechanics of the Band of Heroes, Day of Heroes, and Forgotten Heroes games, which are all very, very good games. But the system is very similar in all of these, so if you can follow this, um, you can play any one of those three of the series. Just each series has a little bit more detail as far as the era that it's in, but for the most part, the game is pretty much the same. So they set up a table of contents here, so we won't be using that for the video here. So this talks about what the Heroes of the Gap is. I'm sure you're already familiar with that. Heroes of the Gap is the 1985 version. Band of Heroes is the World War II version. Day of Heroes is Battle of Mogadishu, and Forgotten Heroes is Battle of Vietnam. All of those games are very, very good. So the first thing that happens in the game is the players choose a scenario, and this is similar with all the games in the series. Each scenario has a fixed number of turns. Each turn consists of phases. It starts with a rally phase. You determine the initiative and rally shaken troops. And a shaken troop is somebody who's been injured. A rally is basically a roll that you do to see if that unit comes back to life. And usually you'll compare that number against their morale. We'll get into that a little bit later. But basically it gives you a chance to bring your units back onto the board if they've been damaged. Second thing is the operation phase. This is the meat of the game. This is where you move and fire and take turns doing things in the game until each player passes consecutively 3 times, or all the units have been moved or fired. And the administrative phase, that's when all the used markers or fired markers are removed from the board, and you advance to the next turn and basically reset. So there's different types of units in the game. You have squads, also called MMCs, which are multi-man counters, and you can see that this unit has 2 units on it, and that's a multi-man counter. This is a single-man counter. You can see by the single unit on there, and a lower strength. And then when these guys break down, when these guys break down into smaller units, they can break down into half squads. You've got leaders, which don't have firepower, range, but they do have their leader bonus, which is here. We'll get into that in more detail in a second, and their movement rating, but mainly the name down here is what denotes a leader. And then heroes have these following factors here. You'll notice, pay attention to red boxes here, means they can assault fire, which is move and fire. I can't remember what the yellow box is, but you'll notice little things happen on these chits, and you got to just look them up. Medics, snipers, weapons teams, and vehicles. Squads are the basic unit of the game. Squads move, fire, and can also melee. And when a squad is undamaged, it's in good order. If it takes damage greater than its morale, it's flipped on its back and turned to a shaken status. If the damage is twice beyond its morale, it takes casualties. If it's damaged 3 times its morale, it's eliminated and removed from the board. Some units have their movement value in a red box. This means the squad is capable of moving half its movement allowance and firing in the same impulse, and this is called an assault move. As far as leaders go, leaders can be placed with a squad. If they're in the same hex as a squad, they can augment its firepower and increase its movement and rally squads that are shaken. The leadership rating is 1 here. So they get to add 1 to the movement, you get to add 1 to its firepower, and you can also add 1 to your rally rolls. Leaders can also activate friendly units in adjacent hexes, allowing the player to move several units from several different hexes in a single impulse. Leaders who take damage can be shaken, wounded, and finally eliminated. And one thing to remember is when you're rallying a stack of units, make sure to rally your leader first, because that +1 will also add to your other units' rally rolls if this unit is successful in coming back. Heroes are special units that can be assigned to a player at the beginning of a scenario. They can also be given to a player when he rolls a 1 on a damage check for another unit being attacked even. So then if he rolls an even number, you get a hero. So the hero is given a random skill card, and it gives him special abilities. Heroes can rally shaken units in the same hex. Medics and snipers. Medics can rally shaken troops, but they cannot engage in combat. If they are engaged in melee without any friendly squads, they are automatically eliminated. Snipers can be placed anywhere on the map and at any time during the operations phase. Snipers can't move once they're placed, and like medics are automatically eliminated when they engage in melee without any friendly squads to protect them. So basically at any point you can drop a sniper onto the board, but he stays there. You can't move him once he's placed, and he basically stays in his spot, has a range of 8, and pops 2 dice. Now a normal unit rolls 1 dice, and he rolls 2. Most units have an inherent firepower, which they can use to shoot at the enemy, and this is on the bottom left of the unit. Their firepower can be enhanced, however, in 2 ways: by using support weapons or using ordnance weapons. In order to be used, support weapons need to be placed with the squad. Their firepower may be added to the squad's firepower. Units can fire a support weapon and make a separate attack with their inherent firepower. Bipod weapons like the M60 require no setup time. Basically, the unit's carrying the weapon in a ready status and dropping and firing with the bipod in place. Tripod weapons are bigger and heavier and have to be broken down and set up during the rally phase. So if you're carrying this unit and moving it from place to place, you flip it over into a carrying status, and once you get to the place where you want to set it up, you have to, in the rally phase, you have to set that weapon back up. So it does take some time. Ordnance weapons usually refers to heavy weapons. Just like support weapons, they need to be attached to a squad in order to be used. On the back of the counter, the to-hit number, the number the player needs to roll under 2d6 in order to hit, is given at different ranges. For example, the squad is firing at a tank 5 hexes away. The player refers to the last column on the right. He needs to roll a 3 or less in order to hit the tank. If the target hits, he uses the penetration value for damage. Ordnance can also be fired at infantry, in which case he uses the HE equivalent to determine the damage. So if the unit is 5 away, this is 6, 5 and 6, so you have to count here. 3 and 4 would be used in this column, and 1 and 2 would be used in this column. So you're in this range here, and you're looking for, rolling 2 dice, you're looking for a 3 or less to hit, and your penetration is 8. If you're shooting at a infantry, you would use this number instead of the 8. If the target was 4 away, you would just go down this column here. So this is your range, and you just go down the column here and follow that. Movement is determined by a unit's movement factor on the lower right hand corner of the counter. Terrain has different effects on movement. So clear terrain costs only 1 movement point to go to move into terrain, while terrain such as forest hexes, buildings, crops cost 2 movement points. Leaders stacked with infantry can increase the movement value of all the squads in the same stack by 2 movement points. Makes pretty much sense. So if you're moving from here to here, it's 1 movement point, and to move from here to here is 2 movement points. In the example below, the infantry uses its movement value in several different ways. It can move through 4 hexes of clear terrain, or it can move from D14 for 1 MP and then spend 2 MP to get into the house. Or the player might choose to move it directly to the south to E14 for 1 MP and into the forest for 2 MP. The unit can stop moving at any time, and the player may choose not to move the unit at all. A terrain chart included with the game provides all the various movement costs for different terrains. Whether your units can see an enemy or not depends on the terrain which the enemy unit occupies and the terrain between you and your enemy. There are three types of terrain: clear, degrading, and blocking. Clear is simply terrain with no objects in it. Enemies that are in clear terrain are always spotted, and you can always be fired upon, provided that there is no blocking terrain between you and your units and the enemy. So what spotting means is that each unit, if it's in a blocking or degrading terrain, is naturally hidden until it does something. So it has cover. So if that unit moves, you lose your cover. If that unit fires, you lose your cover. But if he's standing in a tree line or something like that, then he's considered cover, and you have to roll for that to even spot the unit. Now, if you're in a tree line and the enemy wants to shoot at you, he's got to do that spotting roll, which checks to see if he can see you at all. In the example above, the Soviet squadron C-14 can see and fire at US-264, squad E-13, which is in clear terrain. The Soviet squadron C-14 can't, however, fire at the US squadron F-16 because there's blocking terrain. The forest and D-15 and E-15 between them is blocking terrain. So it blocks line of sight between here and here, but you can see from here to here. Enemy units are automatically spotted when they're adjacent to your units, they move or fire, they're in clear terrain with no blocking terrain between your units and the enemy. Otherwise, the player must make a spotting roll to see the enemy units. Any unit that is not already moved or fired may attempt to spot. The enemy unit that is successfully spotted on a roll of 3 or less and 2 or less in blocking terrain. If a unit spots the enemy, it may immediately fire upon it. Once enemy units are spotted, they are visible to all your forces. After the spotting attempt is made, place an Ops Complete marker on the unit that tries to spot. This means if they do not move, they may only use opportunity fire. So say he tried to spot a guy who's in a tree line and he failed. Then you place an Ops Complete marker on him, means that he's only able to do opportunity fire against the unit when it starts moving, but otherwise it has to sit there. It can't move, it can't do a normal fire, it only can do opportunity fire. Degrading terrain is terrain which obscures the view of an enemy but does not completely block it. Infantry in degrading terrain must be spotted by an enemy before it can be fired upon. In the example below, the Americans in AC-9 can't fire at the Soviet 154 squad and Y-7 because the Soviets are in degrading light forest. The Americans in AC-9 decide to make a spotting attempt and roll a 3. The Soviets are spotted and the American squad may immediately open fire. The spotting does not take up a player's impulse, but only one attempt may be made per impulse. And that's the reason for the Ops Complete marker, if it fails. The Soviets in C-14 automatically spot the US 274 squad in D-15 because it's adjacent. They automatically spot the US 154 squad in E-13 because the unit is in clear terrain. Even though the US 264 squad in H-13 is degrading terrain and would normally require a spotting roll to see, they are automatically spotted because they have moved into that terrain. The Soviets in C-14 can see and fire at any one of the American squads. When the other player moves his forces into range and line of sight to your forces, your units may fire at the moving enemy unit even if it's not your turn, and this is called opportunity fire. The number of attacks that can be used as opportunity fire on an enemy are equal to the movement cost of the terrain in which it's entering. So if it's in a clear terrain, you can fire once. If you're moving into a tree line, tree area, forest, that would give you 2 opportunity fires. In the example below, the Soviets in AG-4 want to move up to AG-4. AG-5 want to move up to AG-4. The American squad in AH-5 may opportunity fire once. The clear hex equals 1 movement point, So 1 opportunity attack at the Soviets as they enter the hex. The 264 U.S. squad in AF4 has already fired earlier in the turn and may not opportunity fire at the Soviets. Units that are stacked together in the same hex can do some special things, but they are also restricted in some ways. Some units in the same hex may move and others may fire in the same impulse. However, those units that move and those that fire in the same impulse must do together. Units may not pick up other friendly units from another hex and move together with them in the same impulse. In the example below, the American player has 264 squads in AF4. He wants one 264 squad to shoot the Soviet squads in AE5 while moving the other 264 squad into the building AG5. He can do all of this in a single impulse. However, he cannot have one unit fire at the Soviet squad while another fires at a different target in the same impulse. He also cannot simultaneously send one 264 U.S. squad to AG5 and another to AE4. He would need 2 separate impulses to do that. In order to shoot at the enemy, you roll 1d6 and add it to the total firepower of the support weapons plus the squad's inherent firepower plus leadership of any of the units. Units in the same hex may combine their firepower, but only one unit in the hex may contribute its full firepower. Usually pick your strongest guy. The other units contribute half of their total firepower. There are units that are exception to this in other games. I'm not sure about this game. In the example below, the American player decides that Sergeant York and his men in AF4 will fire at the Soviet 234 squad in AE5. One of the U.S. squads has an M249 SAW with a firepower of 1. The squad that possesses this wonderful weapon has an inherent firepower of 2, so those two are added together. Sergeant York really wants to kill that Russian squad, so he orders his other 264 squad in the same hex to add their firepower to that combat too. Since the first squad is contributing its full firepower of 3 to the roll, the second squad must half its firepower of 2, so its total contribution of 1 to the roll. Of course, Sergeant York can add his leadership rating to the combat roll, which is a 1. In total, therefore, the American player will be rolling a 1d6 plus 5 for this combat roll. So 2 for the first unit, which is equipped with the weapon, which is 1, brings it to 3. So half of the next unit, which is 1, and then 1 for Sergeant York. When units are fired at, they must make a defensive roll to determine whether or not they are damaged and by how much. Units that take a fire roll 1d6 and subtract the number based on the kind of terrain that they occupy. If the total result is equal to or greater than the enemy firepower, there is no damage. In the example below, the American squads in H14 fire at the Soviet squad sitting in the forest hex of E15. The American rolls a 3 on a 1d6 and adds it to their firepower plus leadership 5 for a total of 8 firepower. The Soviet player rolls a 1d6 for his damage check. He rolls a 6 and adds it to the defensive bonus of the forest hex, which is 2. The total for the defensive roll is therefore 8. Since this is equal to the American firepower, the Soviet squad takes no damage. If the Soviet player's defensive roll had been less than the American's firepower, a roll of 1 plus the terrain 2 for a result of 3, for example, then the Soviet player would need to roll for damage, which we will discuss in the next slide. If the total result of the defensive roll is less than the firing FP result, then the unit being fired upon must roll for damage. The unit being fired upon rolls a d6 and adds the difference between the total defensive roll and the firing unit's firepower. So the first roll minus the second roll is added to a 1d6. Then you check the damage chart to see how the unit is affected. In a previous example, the Soviet squad in F-15 had been fired upon by all the Americans in H-15. The Americans rolled a 3 and added it to their 5 FP for a total of 8. The Soviets then performed a defense roll, getting a 1, and adding their the terrain defensive bonus for forest, which is 2. The defensive result was 3. Since 8 minus 3 is 5, we now perform a damage check by rolling a 1d6 and adding 5 to the roll. The Soviets roll a 4 plus 5 for the previous damage check roll, which totals a 9. The Soviet player checks the damage result for squads. The damage table states that if a squad rolls a total damage result that is greater than a squad's morale, which is 5, right here, but less than double the morale of the squad is shaken, the Soviet players flips over the Soviet squad in F15 and is marked as shaken. Now, if they had rolled a 1 on their damage check, they would roll a die, and if they rolled an even card, this is where the hero would come in. Oh, sorry. If a player rolls a 1 on a damage roll for a squad or a half squad, then he rolls a 1d6 again. If the result is even, a hero is created. The player picks a random hero from his side and puts it into the same hex as his squad. He also chooses a skill card for that hero and places the skill card on top of the hero counter on the board. The hero status is the same as the squad. If the squad is already moved, the hero is marked as moved as well. Each side may have a maximum of 2 heroes. The U.S. squad in D16 fires at the Soviets in A16. The U.S. player rolls a 4 and adds it to his IFP of 2, which is its firepower, for a total of 6. The Soviet player makes a defensive roll of 1d6. He's in clear terrain, so he has no defensive terrain bonus and gets a 3. He must roll again for a damage check and add the difference to it. He rolls a 1 for a total of 4. Since the result is less than his morale, the squad is okay. However, since he rolled a 1 for the damage check, he rolls again to see if he gets a hero. He rolls a 4, which is an even number, and he randomly gets a hero Drago and a skill card Charismatic. He places Drago in a skill card with the Soviet squad in the same hex. If the Soviet squad has already moved this turn, Drago would also be marked as moved. When opposing units occupy the same hex, they enter close combat or melee. Melee combat is calculated differently than normal fire combat. Neither side can fire into the melee hex. If a friendly good order unshaken squad enters the hex with an enemy squad or squads that are shaken, no other good order units in that hex, the friendly squads will automatically eliminate the shaken squads. In the example below, good old Sergeant York in H15 has let rip and shaken the Soviet squad in E15. On his next impulse, the American player sends out the 274 squad in H17 to enter the H15 hex and melee the shaken Soviets. Since shaken units cannot fire, the American player doesn't have to worry about opportunity fire. He moves 274 squad into E15 with the Soviets and automatically eliminating them in melee. Good order units that engage with melee with good order units in the hex resolve combat by: the attacker picks one enemy unit in the melee hex. The attacker calculates that enemy unit's total firepower, all support weapons except grenade launchers count. Attacker calculates all the firepower of all attacking friendly units. Attacker calculates and simplifies the odds. Attacker rolls and consults the melee results table. Attacker may use leadership rating of any leaders in the melee hex to add to the die roll. And if the attacker has the hero in the melee, shift the melee results 1 column to the right. Defender then does the same. If good order units on both sides still remain, then melee is left unresolved until subsequent turns. In the example below, Sergeant York decides to engage in melee with a good order Soviet squad in F15. He moves into the hex and brings along a US 264 squad with an M60, and a hero named Hobbs also comes to the party. The Americans decide to attack the Soviet 234 squad, natural, since it's the only enemy squad in the hex. He adds up his own total firepower, which is 5. 5 compared to 2 as a ration is 3.5 to 1, which rounds down to 3 to 1. The US player rolls 2d6 for a total of 3, which is terrible. However, we add 1 to the U.S. player's roll because of Sergeant York's leadership rating, which results in 4. We also shift the column 1 to the right on the melee table and find the kill number is 4. The squad is immediately eliminated. Note that even though melee is resolved, no one may fire into the hex. So some terms you might want to be familiar with: assault move, AM. DFT is the direct fire table, which is on the player aid in the book. Inherent firepower is the same as firepower on the bottom left. Line of sight is your ability to see one unit to another in the game. Different things that can affect your line of sight are degrading terrain, which is kind of inhibits your view, or blocking terrain, which blocks your line of sight. Multi-man counters, which are squads, which have 2 figures on them, and single-man counters have 1 unit on them. Movement points is how many points it costs to move through certain types of terrain. Going through clear costs you 1, going through buildings costs you 2, and you deduct those from the movement total of your unit on the bottom right hand corner of the unit. The ordnance fire table is on the back of each ordnance chit. And then the support weapon, we talked about that earlier also. So that concludes the PowerPoint presentation. Again, I want to thank Kevin and Brad for a wonderful job and a document that I think will help a lot of people learn this game. It's a great system, and I really enjoy it, and I hope you get a chance to play this game system, and take care.